Hello, my name is Calvin, and I will be talking about the Clean Air Act of 1963, as well as some of the more radical changes that have been added to it in 1970. For now, I'll give you a brief overview as to what the Clean Air Act is, and then I will go more in depth with the history that led up to the Clean Air Act, catalysts that have helped the act succeed in Congress, as well as accomplishments and influences that the Clean Air Act have achieved. So the Clean Air Act is one of the United States' first and most influential environmental laws. It was administered by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency in coordination with state and local governments, with the goal of improving air quality for all and protecting the ozone. There are a number of implementations as to how it worked towards this goal, but I'll talk about those later on. First, I think it's important to talk about the time period with which this act took place. The 1960s leading into the 1970s had a very noticeable distinction between this generation and the generation prior. Around this time, children from the baby boom, as in children born around World War II or shortly after, began reaching their 20s, and this increase led to a change in culture and in attitude. In the 1950s, America had just come home from winning World War II. The people at that time felt somewhat entitled to a simple life. They wanted things to be secure, and they wanted to enjoy the fruits of their labor without having to worry about war or nuclear bombs raining down from above. If you look at television shows and other stereotypes that depicted the 1950s, it was all about having a model patriotic family. Everyone wanted to own a house in the suburbs, the father would be working, the mother would stay home, and they would have 2 or 3 kids. It's not to say that the 1950s or the ideal 1950 family lifestyle was bad, but it lacked self-expression and the feeling to be different or to feel like an individual. As we move into the 1960s, the newer generation became more free-thinking and felt the need to be different from the traditional family. You see this in the music that played during that time, the rock and rolls, the blues, the psychedelic styles, things that played during this time really gave people a sense of escape from their expectations to be towards this traditional family lifestyle. And it gave them a way to express themselves as well. During this time, you see a rise in divorce rates, an increase in number of women working outside of the home, an increase in number of unmarried individuals. All of these things went against the traditional family lifestyle. Beyond that, people also needed a sense of drive. They wanted something to aspire for and to work towards. You're the generation that follows people who fought and won a war for democracy and for freedom. You want something to give you the same sense of self-worth that your parents had. And you see examples of the passion that this generation had through the multiple civil rights movements, the space race, and so on. Another major goal that the new generation began targeting their focus towards is towards environmentalism. After the 1950s, the US experienced an economic boom in industrialization. The rising workforce, as well as an increase in number of consumers, allowed many companies to pursue larger manufacturing quotas. This led to a larger increase in production using the same inefficient manufacturing methods as before, and inadvertently created more waste and pollution. At the same time, media began growing. People were beginning to realize that the US, as well as other developed countries, were beginning to suffer from pollutants that came with industrialization. On top of that, lesser developed countries were falling victim to exploitation of natural resources. It was no longer unnoticed when environmental issues took place. Issues such as pollution of factories and power plants, oil spills, raw sewage, toxic dumps, pesticides, loss in biodiversity. All of these things became more and more demanding issues, and the generation of the 1960s leading into the 1970s chose to answer such a call. A pivotal moment in sparking the environmental movement in the 1960s was the book that we learned in class by Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. The book brought attention to farming practices and the use of harmful pesticides. The momentum continued throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s. The world's first Earth Day is a great example of how massive the environmental movement became in the United States. 20 million people across 2,000 college campuses and in Washington, D.C. began mobilizing for Earth Day to push for environmental laws and unity. People began to see Earth as something without boundaries and without walls. They began realizing that pollution not only affected their country, but affected other countries as well. And so people really pushed for unity during this time. Senators such as Howard Baker, Secretary of State Edmund Muskie, and President Richard Nixon used this momentum and public support as an opportunity to push for environmental laws and improvements. Things such as the Clean Air Act that we're talking about now, the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, and the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency were all created using the momentum in the 1970s. Now that we've covered how the Clean Air Act was created, let's talk about Let's talk a little bit more on how the act works specifically. The Clean Air Act is governed by the EPA, and the EPA sets standards as to how much pollution an agency and organization is allowed to pollute. These standards are passed down to state and local governments, where they enforce such standards, as well as provide basic statistics for the EPA to use for future standards. The air has no walls and no boundaries, so the Clean Air Act focuses on limiting the amount of pollution that comes into the air. Things such as smog and haze that come from power plants, manufacturing, and automobiles. All of these things contribute to pollution and contribute to poor air quality. By reducing the amount of pollutant in the air, we passively reduce the harmful effects that they cause. Things such as acid rain that strip soil of its nutrients, toxic air that cause cancer, and other things that make the air more difficult for people with breathing conditions such as asthma to breathe with. It also creates an imbalance in air particles in the ozone, which we're now realizing is creating climate change. So how does the Clean Air Act work, and what are standards that are set by the EPA? So the Clean Air Act mainly focuses on transportation and automobiles, but these standards can also be moved towards manufacturing and power plants. The EPA sets standards to a car by limiting how much exhaust it can emit. On top of that, the EPA also forced companies to reformulate their gasoline to not use chemicals that cause cancer, such as benzene. Now, all of gasoline also uses a low amount of sulfur, because sulfur has been found to deplete the ozone of its quality. Regular inspections are also made by all forms of transportation to ensure that these standards are met. The same goes for power plants and manufacturing. Waste is managed and accounted for. The height of those exhaust towers that you see coming out of factories are set to a certain height to ensure that the pollutants don't reach ground level and pollute the air below for the people. Power plants that are created now are set with higher standards to use as much of their resources as effectively as possible. That way we can reduce the amount of pollutants that come out of those. So lastly, I'm going to talk about the accomplishments that the Clean Air Act has made and why it's one of the most successful environmental laws in the world. Since the Clean Air Act has been put in place, 6 of the most common air pollutants have been reduced by 50%. Air toxics from large industrial sectors such as chemical plants, petroleum refineries, and paper mills have reduced by 70%. 90% of cars that are on the road today are cleaner than the cars that were in the 1970s. And lastly, the ozone-depleting chemicals such as sulfur have stopped being used on a large scale. At the same time, while regulations have increased, the US GDP has tripled since the 1970s, our energy consumption has increased by 50%, and our use of vehicles have doubled since the 1970s. This shows that not only are we using more of our transportation, but we're using more energy and we're being more effective with it. We're producing less waste, and as a result, the Clean Air Act is successful because air quality has improved since then.